A man I once managed was a struggling sales rep named Scott. Scott was a high school educated former tree pruner. He seemed to lack the drive, sophistication, and people skills sales requires. Scott's numbers were dismal, and it didn't look like they would change for the better anytime soon. I'd just been hired by Scott's company, and my job was turning around the entire sales force. The first thing I did was confront him with a challenge. I came to our first meeting wearing a cowboy hat. In a few minutes, I'm going to throw this hat into the middle of this conference table, I began. Whoever picks up that hat and puts it on will then stand up and say, "I'm the fastest sales gun in the West. If the rest of you know what's good for you, don't draw on me." This self-appointed gunslinger will then challenge the rest of you one by one to a head-to-head sales competition. If the gunslinger succeeds in shooting all his challengers down like a dog, he gets $1,000 in crisp, cold, hard cash. Anyone who rises to the challenge and outsells the gunslinger gets $100. Then I tossed my hat onto the table and waited. And waited. Nobody moved. All eyes were glued to that hat. The tension was excruciating. It was my first day on the job. What would I do if no one picked up the hat? Then, suddenly, Scott lurched forward, grabbed the hat, and put it on his head. He stood up, made his speech, and then went belly-hole to belly-hole with every other member of that team. All of them had been regularly outselling him. So they all gladly accepted his gunslinger's challenge. Minutes later, the phones were ringing, and the reps were selling like the fate of the world hung in the balance. I was very much relieved by the reaction, but I was worried about my hired gun. Scott was definitely an underdog. Courageous? Sure. But could this former tree climber really do it? At the end of the first day, I checked the numbers. Even though sales had exploded, I was amazed to find Scott on top. It was the same on the second day. On the third day, I watched in awe as Scott leaped out of his chair and screamed at the receptionist, "Give me a call! For God's sake, give me another call!" Scott went from the worst performing rep to the best, and it wasn't even close. He destroyed all his challengers by a wide margin. But it didn't end there. Over the ensuing weeks and months, Scott was consistently the number 1 or 2 rep. One day, I could no longer contain my curiosity. I tapped Scott on the shoulder, and after he had removed his headphones, I asked, "Scott, you've gone from our worst rep to our best rep, and you did it almost overnight. What's your secret?" Scott grinned up at me and said, "Augie, once you know what it feels like to live your best, you never want to go back." So what happened? Let's blame it on the hat. First, I'm not talking about just any old hat. I could have tossed a baseball cap, a golf hat, hell, a top hat for that matter. But a cowboy hat, now that's something special. It conjures up the image of the self-made man, the epic myth of the American dream, the lone rider subduing a vast frontier. But this American myth ignores its most important feature. The American continent wasn't tamed by rugged, range-riding individuals battling the elements all alone. I grew up in and relied on an America built by a collection of individuals, striving toward a common goal. My family, my neighbors, my lifelong friendships, many of whom I leaned upon at crucial junctures in my life. When Scott picked up my cowboy hat, he raised the stakes for the entire sales force. In that moment, they became so much more than a group of individuals with selfish ambitions. They became a team, a community. Sure, they were focused on making more sales, but they were doing it together. And 8 months later, sales had gone up 500%. We all face daily struggles like these. Sometimes these struggles seem beyond our ability. We feel alone. But in those moments of incipient despair, remember one thing. You just have to pick up the damn hat.